The courtroom was silent, heavy with anticipation as Jeļena Ostapenko awaited the final decision that would define her future. Once celebrated as a Grand Slam champion, she now sat pale and motionless, staring at the bench as the sentence was delivered. The weight of the words seemed to crush her instantly. Her face collapsed, shoulders trembling, and the entire room witnessed a dramatic fall from grace. This was not just another hearing. It was the unraveling of a career before the world's eyes. The build-up to the verdict. The collapse inside the courtroom was not an isolated moment, but the inevitable result of months of mounting pressure. Jeļena Ostapenko, once celebrated as a Grand Slam champion, arrived carrying the baggage of repeated controversies that had slowly dismantled her reputation. What began with her infamous US Open outburst against Taylor Townsend spiraled into a chain of consequences she could not outrun. Those few seconds of insult at the net were replayed endlessly, fueling outrage not just in tennis circles but across broader media. Sponsors withdrew their support. Tournament organizers distanced themselves and fans debated whether she had crossed a line that could never be repaired. The Women's Tennis Association responded by opening a formal review, gathering complaints from officials, fellow players, and even spectators who had witnessed her conduct at various tournaments. What emerged was not a single lapse in judgment, but a pattern: repeated clashes with umpires, harsh words toward ball kids, and an inability to separate competitive fire from disrespect. By the time disciplinary hearings were scheduled, Ostapenko had already lost control of her image. The conversation was no longer about her forehand or her 2017 French Open title. It was about her character. Legal advisors warned her that the case was serious, but even they underestimated how decisive the judgment could be. The courtroom atmosphere reflected this tension. Stern WTA representatives in the front rows, journalists eager for a headline, and Ostapenko herself sitting visibly diminished, fingers interlaced tightly on the table. She had once thrived in the spotlight, but here the attention was suffocating. This was no tennis match with another chance to rebound. It was the definitive test of accountability, and her legacy hung in the balance. The atmosphere inside the courtroom. The courtroom on the day of sentencing carried an atmosphere unlike anything Jeļena Ostapenko had ever faced. It was not the roar of a stadium or the tension of a final set tiebreak, but a silence that pressed down heavily on everyone present. From the moment she entered, dressed in muted tones and avoiding eye contact, the contrast with her former confident self was stark. Photographers angled for every shot, reporters scribbled in anticipation, and officials from the Women's Tennis Association occupied the front rows with grave expressions. Every detail of the setting seemed designed to strip away the glamour of sport and replace it with accountability. The polished wooden benches, the elevated seat of the presiding official, and the subdued hum of quiet whispers created a stage where her career would be defined not by talent, but by judgment. Even the air felt different, charged, as though everyone was holding their breath. Ostapenko's demeanor betrayed the weight of the moment. Once known for her fiery gestures and unshakable confidence, she now sat stiffly, hands folded tightly in front of her. Her eyes occasionally flicked toward her legal team, but mostly stayed lowered, as if acknowledging the inevitability of what was to come. Those who had followed her career closely noted how unrecognizable she seemed. The bold champion had given way to a figure bracing for consequences. Beyond the walls, the wider world was already waiting. Updates were being live tweeted, television outlets cut into programming with rolling coverage, and fans speculated on forums about how severe the punishment might be. Inside, however, the silence was almost unbearable. The gravity of the occasion was not lost on anyone. This was more than a player's disciplinary hearing. It was a defining test of whether tennis could enforce its own values when one of its stars had stepped too far over the line. The reading of the sentence. When the presiding official began to read the verdict, the air inside the courtroom shifted instantly. What had been tense silence turned into an atmosphere so heavy it seemed to press on everyone's chest. The words came slowly, formal, and deliberate, outlining the decision of the disciplinary committee. The ruling was clear. Jeļena Ostapenko was to be banned for life from professional tennis. Her eligibility to compete on the WTA Tour permanently revoked. The reaction was immediate. A low murmur ran through the rows of journalists and observers, the kind of sound that follows a collective shock. Even those who had expected severe consequences seemed taken aback by the finality of the sentence. Suspensions, fines, or temporary bans were familiar outcomes, but a lifetime removal from the sport was almost unheard of. This was not a punishment with a path to redemption. It was an ending. For Ostapenko, the words seemed unbearable. She sat frozen at first, her hands trembling slightly against the wooden table, her posture collapsing in on itself. Cameras captured the moment she covered her face, her shoulders quivering, and finally lowered her head as if the weight of the judgment was too heavy to hold upright. The fierce competitor, known for outbursts of defiance, was now reduced to silence and visible despair. The statement continued, citing repeated violations of conduct, discriminatory remarks, and behavior deemed fundamentally incompatible with the integrity of the sport. Each phrase reinforced that this was not a single lapse, but a documented pattern that tennis authorities could no longer ignore. By the time the official finished, the message was clear to everyone present. This was a decisive attempt to protect the sport's values, even at the cost of erasing one of its former champions from its future. The collapse in court. The decisive moment came not with the words themselves, but with Ostapenko's physical reaction to them. As the final sentence was delivered, her composure cracked in full view of the cameras. She leaned forward, her face buried in her hands, shoulders trembling uncontrollably. Observers described it as a visible collapse. The instant when denial gave way to the full weight of reality. No longer a competitor fighting against opponents on a court, she became a figure consumed by consequences she could not fight off. The silence in the room was broken only by the scribbling of pens and the rapid clicking of cameras. Every movement was documented, every detail captured, the tears rolling down her cheeks, the shaky breaths, the way she gripped the edge of the desk as if anchoring herself against the weight of the decision. It was the image of a career imploding, one that would be replayed across news broadcasts for days to come. For those who had followed her journey, the scene carried an undeniable sense of tragedy. This was the same athlete who once stood on the clay courts of Roland Garros, fearless and unshaken as she lifted the French Open trophy at just 20 years old. That memory now clashed with the reality of a woman unable to withstand the consequences of her own actions. The collapse symbolized more than personal defeat. It was the stark illustration of how quickly success can unravel when behavior overshadows achievement. In that courtroom, Ostapenko's fall from grace became complete. The strong-willed persona that once defined her had vanished, replaced by vulnerability and despair. The collapse did not soften the ruling, nor did it alter the verdict. Instead, it etched a lasting image. A former champion brought low not by an opponent across the Met, but by her own choices and the system that finally held her accountable. The reactions beyond the court. The fallout from the sentencing was immediate and global. Within minutes of the verdict being announced, news alerts spread across major outlets and social media platforms lit up with commentary. Clips of Ostapenko's collapse circulated worldwide, shared not only by tennis fans, but by those who had little interest in the sport until now. The images of a once celebrated champion breaking down under the weight of judgment became symbolic of a wider conversation about accountability in professional athletics. Players past and present offered their perspectives. Some expressed sympathy, noting the mental strain of life on the tour, but most emphasized that her punishment reflected more than a single incident. Naomi Osaka, long a voice for fairness and integrity, highlighted how the ruling was not just about one moment of poor sportsmanship, but about repeated actions that undermined the values of tennis. Rafael Nadal, typically cautious in his public comments, released a rare statement stressing that respect is non-negotiable in the sport and that consequences, however severe, were necessary when that respect is broken. Sponsors who had already distanced themselves from Ostapenko used the verdict to reinforce their decisions. Brands emphasized their commitment to values of equality, professionalism, and inclusion, drawing a line between themselves and the conduct that had led to her downfall. For the Women's Tennis Association, the ruling was presented as a necessary measure to protect the reputation of the sport. Officials stressed that the decision was not taken lightly, but was the result of months of investigation and a consistent pattern of behavior. For fans, the reactions were divided. Some viewed the lifetime ban as too harsh, questioning whether a path to redemption should have been left open. Others argued it was overdue, a strong message that professional athletes cannot hide behind talent when their conduct consistently disrespects the game. What united nearly everyone, however, was the recognition that tennis had entered a turning point. The decision carried weight not only for Ostapenko but for the culture of accountability across the entire sport. The larger implications: the sentencing of Jeļena Ostapenko was more than the downfall of a single player. It became a defining moment for professional tennis. Rarely had the sport witnessed such a public and irreversible judgment. One that extended beyond the mechanics of competition into questions of ethics, respect, and the responsibility of athletes as public figures. Her lifetime ban drew a line in the sand, signaling that conduct matters as much as talent, and that the institutions governing the sport were prepared to protect its values at any cost. For tennis, the implications are long-lasting. The ruling set a precedent that disciplinary measures are not symbolic warnings but enforceable boundaries with real consequences. Younger players rising through the ranks absorb the message that careers can be undone not by defeat on the court but by choices off it. Coaches, sponsors, and tournament officials alike began re-examining codes of conduct, media training, and expectations of professionalism, knowing that the eyes of a public were fixed on how the sport handled issues of respect and fairness. Culturally, the case forced a broader reckoning. It reignited debates about the treatment of athletes, the pressures of competition, and the fine line between passion and hostility. Yet, it also brought overdue recognition of how harmful words and actions, especially when repeated, can erode trust in the sport's integrity. Ostapenko's collapse in court came to represent not just personal defeat, but the breaking point of a system unwilling to ignore misconduct any longer. As the dust settled, one truth became undeniable. Tennis had changed. The image of a player once celebrated for her fearless spirit reduced to tears under judgment reminded everyone that legacies are fragile, shaped not only by victories but by behavior. For Ostapenko, the collapse marked an ending. For tennis, it marked a new beginning, one defined by accountability, respect, and the demand that greatness must extend beyond the scoreboard.